Dad, a son's first hero, and a daughter's first love. Well, today is Father's Day, and how appropriate to begin a 7-part series entitled Family Matters, which has a double entendre to it, and I like to emphasize the last word, family matters. And it really does. Well, it was coming up to Father's Day, and a fellow preacher asked me, "Do you have any father jokes?" And I replied, "No, but I've met several." Well, seriously, why is it that in this unusual historic age that fathers today are minimalized at best and portrayed as incompetent boobs at worst? For instance, there's the television program that some of you have known called The Simpsons. And he's an alcoholic husband, an alcoholic dad who has an IQ that's less than a slug. And then there's another sitcom which is banned from the Trickey household called Father's Guy. I don't want to know if you've seen it. And it's about the same. And it puts down fatherhood. And what about Father's Day cards, which don't fare much better? In fact, a company that sells cards, by the way, did you know that Hallmark sells humorous Father's Day cards that belittle fathers because they found out they sell? And another company by the name of NobleWorks Cars, they rated their best-selling Father's Day card as one with the caption saying, "Keep calm, Dad, we've found the remote." I will not tell you what the second was. But the third was this. It had a picture, and it was called The Evolution of Dads. And it was the standard evolution chart, with a monkey, and then a Neanderthal man. And then there was a man hunched over in his reclining chair with the TV on and the remote in his hand, and said, "Mankind, dads." Well, there's the evolution of humankind according to this world. But if our culture belittles and berates the image of dads, the Bible itself elevates fathers, not only as their role in most of history as provider and protector, but also in their ideal form as pointing as a loving image to our Father which is in heaven. Well, Jesus in Matthew chapter 7, verse 9 to 11, uses such an example of a human father less than perfect, pointing to our perfect heavenly Father above. And Jesus says this, "What man is there among you who, if his son asks for bread, will he give him a stone?" And then it says, "If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask?" Well, in Psalm chapter 127, verses 3 to 5, we overhear the voice of God speaking to fathers everywhere about the incalculable value of children, saying, "Sons are a heritage from the Lord, children a reward from Him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are sons born in one's youth." And then in the very colorful language of the Old Testament, it says, "Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them." Well, how might we describe what a godly father might just look like? And let me begin by saying that the first thing I want to share is that spending time is time well spent. Let me say it again. Spending time is time well spent. And obviously this regards to quality time. We all know about that. But you know, you can spend time with your children, or perhaps you've had dad spend time with you, and you're there, but you're not really there. Perhaps some of you have heard the word or the phrase, the serial look. And it was a title that came from a man by the name of Smith, who discovered that when he was a boy, the only time he had with his dad was at the breakfast table as they would be chewing over their cornflakes. And Dad was there, but he wasn't really there because he was just staring at him, really beyond him, in a kind of look that we call me-go. Do you know what me-go is? My eyes glaze over. And obviously he was thinking about all the things he had to do that day, his mammoth to-do list, and about that business meeting he had to be in, or that very annoying person in the next office/cell beside him. And he got home so late that breakfast is the only time he was there, but he wasn't really there. And the same could be said about television. Unless father and daughters and fathers and sons are engaged with each other while they're watching television, you're really sitting alone and watching the same program, but you're there and not there at the same time. Well, men, I want to tell you that quality time is important, but let me go further and say that quantity time is important too. I thank God for a father who was imperfect and sometimes had a temper. Dad, if you're listening, please forgive me. And he's gone now to heaven. But he chose to spend quality and quantity time with myself and my brother Tom. And not just in the summer, but have you ever noticed that in Ontario, we actually have a spring and a fall? And I remember those lazy springs and summers and falls, those hazy summers. And Dad would purposely, even though he was a very busy electrician, he would purposely choose to spend Saturdays, all the days Saturday, unless there was emergency. And we would go out canoeing and fishing, and we would go camping in northern Ontario, and we would do all kinds of fun things. In fact, to this day, even though I've traveled so many cities around the world, I will always think of a little lake called Saginaw and a park called Bon Echo as the most wonderful place in the world where I learned to swim and we camped as children, because that's where my dad spent time with us. Well, I've spent time in other places, including living in the balmy, beautiful, blistering beaches of the Bahamas. But there's still no place like this cold lake in northern Ontario, because that's where Dad spent time with us. Well, but you say, Henry, you don't know me. You don't know the demanding hours that my job takes and my lifestyle. Well, it's impossible for me to spend quantity time, let alone quality time, with my kids. But is it? Is it really? We have lots of time for other things. Well, I spoke last week, or a couple of weeks ago, yes, it was last week, about the spiritual formation issue of living a simple life. Do you remember that? Jesus exemplified that. And a few months before, last year, we did another spiritual formation talk on downward mobility, in which Jesus was the primal example. In him we have downward mobility, the way to the cross. And if you don't have the time for your children, then you may want to think about downward mobility. Don't ever be brainwashed by the world that tells us the big lie that Bigger is better, much is more, and money is wealth. Don't believe it. For you can be a millionaire and have the biggest house in the world and the fanciest car. You can be as rich, as they used to say, as rich as Croesus, and yet be the poorest man in town. Well, you might want to consider another job. Never leave your job without first finding another job. But you might want to consider downsizing, maybe even getting a job that has more time, less money. You might even have to sell that big house and move to a smaller place and an older part in town. But you need to do what it takes to give time to your children. I remember a young lady some time ago in a congregation where I served, and I was asking about her dad. And suddenly her frown turned upside down, her smile turned upside down, and she said to me, "Pastor, that man is not my dad." And I was curious, and I didn't want to ask a bunch of questions, but I was curious, and I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "He's my biological dad, but he's not my father because he spends so much time at work, I don't know who he is." How sad is that? How sad is that? Well, I knew a man in Listowel. That was a long time ago, a little church in southwestern Ontario, not very far from Guelph. First church where my wife and I had just been married, our honeymoon church. And there was a little old man, a colorful chap. He was an elderly man. And for all you knew, you'd think he was the poorest man in town. He only had one suit, and he wore it all the time. And it was a blue suit. It had once been beautiful, but it was all worn out and dusty. And whenever I saw him, and he would sometimes come to our church, although he was an Anglican, and whenever I would see him in town, and he'd sometimes come and sit on the porch with us, and we'd chat. Every time we spoke, his name was Norm, and he quoted an unusual verse, one I read before but never caught my eye. And I don't know his true story, what broken heart he must have had, what sorrow was in his heart. But this is the verse he quoted always. "It is better to have a dinner of herbs with love than a stalled ox and hatred therewith." Have you ever heard that verse? Let me say it again. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox where hatred there is. Translation: it's better to live in a dilapidated shack where there's love than to live in $1 million home where there's just hatred. Again, I don't know what sorrow he carried. He was never married, never had any children, and when he died, we found out he was probably the richest man in town. But what sorrow? Better a dinner of herbs where love is than a stalled ox and hatred therein. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 17. Well, spend time. Time well spent is not time wasted. And the second thing I want to bring to the fore is this. Tell them and tell them again. Tell them and tell them again. And I mean that you love them. Tell them and tell them again and again that you love them. Every time I see my kids, probably every time Jonathan gets up in the morning or before he goes to bed, I say, "Jennifer, Janice, Jonathan, I love you," and we hug. Perhaps I say that because in my own family, even though I love my parents, it was of that day and age. They'd gone through the Depression, and people weren't just touchy-feely in those days. And so we decided when we had children, we would just tell them and hug them. And Jonathan, when you're 50 years of age, I won't live that long when you're 70, but when you're 50 and you'll still be towering above you, I'm going to hug you every day with a man hug. A non-gay male bonding hug. I tell you, I love you. And even on the phone with my other two, we end by always saying, I love you, dear. So tell him and tell him again. Well, you say, I thought the primary role of a dad was to discipline his children. And yes, that's exactly part of it. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11 says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. That's the favorite text of all dads and moms. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for it's right. And Proverbs chapter 3, verse 11 and 12 says, in essence, the very same thing. My son, do not despise the Lord's discipline, and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines you because he loves you as a father the son that he delights in. And here's the problem. It is possible to discipline a child too harshly and too often. Listen to the words of Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. And some of you know that this happens in your life. It says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. And Colossians chapter 3, verse 21 says exactly the same thing. Father, do not embitter your children, or they'll be discouraged. And some dads who exasperate their children, when they're grown up, they'll distance themselves and they'll always remember what happened as a kid. Well, do you remember when you fell asleep as a child and you were in the car and your dad picked you up? Maybe you were still asleep and took you to that bed and tucked you in. Or perhaps do you remember as a child when my dad would take me on his shoulders, and sometimes he would get down on the floor and tickle us to death. But the point is, carrying us in his arms. Well, if you remember that, then I want you to remember a verse from Isaiah 46, verse 4, and be ready to be moved by it. Even in your old age, God is speaking. I am He. Even when your hair turns gray, I will carry you. And looking at some of you, I want to say, even when your hair falls out, I will carry you. Isn't that a wonderful verse? So dads and future dads and granddads, I say to you, tell them and tell them again and again that I love you and I'm so proud of you. And I'll always love you unconditionally. I may not always approve of what you do, but I'll always approve of you. Well, if spending time is time well spent, and we should tell them and tell them again that we love them, the next thing I want to hear, dads, is the question we might verbally or non-verbally say to our kids, and it's this question. Kids, do I want you to do as I say or do as I do? Do as I say or do as I do? That's the question, isn't it? Someone has said every father should remember that one day his son, and we can say daughters too, will follow in his example instead of his advice. I remember a cartoon in a Christian magazine entitled Leadership. And it had this beautiful cartoon. Picture this now. There is a cartoon of a man, unshaven. His hair is a mess. He's still in his pajamas and his bathrobe. And he's sitting in his lazy boy chair. I shouldn't talk too much because I have one. And he's reading his Sunday morning paper, and you can see a boy about this high coming in, and he's got a tie on, and his hair's well combed, and he's got an oversized Bible underneath his arm. And the caption in the cloud says, "Dad, guess what I learned in Sunday school today, hypocrite?" Well, seriously, we're to live the way that will show them how to live. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 9 encourages and warns us at the same time. The man of integrity walks securely, but he who takes crooked paths will be found out. And I add to that the first people to find out whether we have integrity or not are our family. Well, whether it was intended or not, it was George Hubbard who said, "Our Father is more than 100 school teachers." And there was an American author by the name of Clarence Buddington who spoke, "My father didn't tell me," listen, this is powerful, "My father didn't tell me how to live. He lived and let me watch him do it." Now just imagine you're in the West Coast, perhaps on Vancouver Island or perhaps down to California or Oregon, and you're looking up at a Douglas fir, not the highest, but one of the highest and tallest trees in the world, and it's got a trunk so big you can drive a car literally through a hole that's been made in it. I've seen such trees. I think there used to be one in Stanley Park. I'm not sure it's still there. You're looking up this massive tree, and for one reason or another, it falls to the ground, and it takes down with it a wide circle of smaller trees. And I want you to know that when a child looks up to his dad as his hero, when that father falls and fails spiritually, the impact can be devastating. Well, the question as I asked is it do as I say or do as I do? And that leads me to say something else, and it might be surprising. Give them permission to fail. And here I'm dealing with, I don't know if I made this up or I heard it somewhere. The gift of originality is having the blessing of remembering what other people say and the gift of forgetting who said it. So I don't know if this is original with me or not, but I like to say, give them permission to fail. And often this is what I want to talk about. I call this the unpleasable parent syndrome. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? The unpleasable parent syndrome. And how many of us grew up as children or even adult children and have been plagued all our lifetime by knowing we can never measure up. We can never be good enough to earn our dad's love and his acceptance. Well, Jesus told a parable in Luke chapter 15, and if you've been in churches much time, you will probably know it as the prodigal son. But I like to think of it as the prodigal father, because the word prodigal means someone who either spends money in a reckless and extravagant way, as the son did, or it can also apply to the father who lavished his forgiveness in an outrageous way on the son. And so the prodigal father outdoes the prodigalness of his son by running to him and embracing him and forgiving him even before his son asks for forgiveness. And he takes him back into the family and orders that a banquet be arranged that night for his lost son returned. And that's what I mean when I say not so much permission to fail, but when we fail, God is willing to to rescue us and bring us back. Is Phoebe Chan here today? Well, she was leading much of the Father's Day celebration in her here, and she said something wonderful. Oh, there you are. I wrote you to tell me if I got this story straight, so correct me if I'm wrong. But you told a beautiful story when you were speaking about your dad, and you told us about how when you were in Hong Kong, when you were teaching there this spring, perhaps it was this spring or was it earlier? Okay, close enough. And you told us about a car accident that you had. And if I have my facts straight, you were, of course, all right, but it kind of damaged quite bad your bumper. And out of guilt and out of fear, you phoned home back to here and told your dad about it. And expecting to hear the worst, he said to you, "Congratulations!" What do you mean, congratulations? You have just taken a step further in being a good driver. Isn't that wonderful? There's the perfect example of a dad who gave her permission to fail. And I want to add to your words yesterday and saying that all of us at some time will be in a car wreck. And if not in a literal car wreck, we will have a car wreck of our lives, and we'll be broken and will need to be repaired. Thank God He's the one who rescues us and brings us back to Himself, even when we've wrecked our lives. Well, the actual words are attributed to an Australian photographer named Anne Geddes, but the concept you've known perhaps for years when she says, any man can be a father, but it takes a special man to be a dad. Well, if time spent is time well spent, and we've talked about some of the other things, something else I want to touch on is this. Let them dream their own dreams. Let me say it again. Let them dream their own dreams. Don't make them fulfill the unfulfilled dreams that you had and never reached. You had your chance. Now it's time to give them wings, and at the appropriate time, let them go to find their own dreams. Why? Because every child, every person on planet Earth is different. Now there's a Proverbs in chapter 22, verse 6 of that book. And you know what it means already. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not turn from it. And obviously, the context and the meaning is talking about raising a child knowing right from wrong and hearing about God. But some people have taken that a bit further, and I'm not sure about the interpretation, but some persons have put it with this emphasis: train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he shall not depart from it. Again, I'm not sure of that interpretation, but it points us to another point that's very true, that every one of our kids is different. And dads and moms, you know that from the first time they came out of the womb. My daughter Jennifer was born, and she had the loudest scream of any baby on earth. And she's been speaking loud ever since. And when she talks, her hands wave like a windmill. I don't know where she gets that from. And you know from the moment they're born, they're different. And God makes them different. Isn't that wonderful? And we need to let them dream their own dreams and bless them to go the way that God has wired them and the way He wants them to follow Him in His direction. Well, certainly one man said this, my father used to say, it's never too late to do anything you want to do. And then he said, you never know what you can accomplish until you try. And the son who received that word, his name was Michael Jordan, one of the greatest basketball players that ever lived. So let them dream their own dream. And so, spend time is time well spent. And tell them again you love them. And understand that in the long run, they will not do as you say, but do as you did. And remember also to give them permission to fail. Give them wings and let them dream their dreams. All of which leads to the inevitable conclusion. And the question, how do you want to be remembered? That's the question, isn't it? How do you want to be remembered? And you know what? For some of us, after 10 years, we won't be remembered at all. And funny thing, I've conducted not very many funerals here in this church, but even while I've been here, many funerals in my last church. But over the years, since 1980 that I've been a pastor, I don't even know how many funerals I've conducted. But I've noticed something. When all the family and friends and colleagues are there, almost never, or if so just a few times, does anybody in their tribute say anything about their job and how they climbed the ladder to success or how much money they earned. And if it is mentioned, it's hardly heard and it's not spoken for long. Well, I'll tell you at your funeral, after your heart has stopped and you've breathed your last breath and you've gone to heaven, I'll tell you what your loved ones want to hear, even if you didn't live up to it. What they want to hear, and what they want to hear that's true, is that Dad loved me and he accepted me and he loved my mom and he was good to his friends and extended family. And in the long run, friends, here on planet Earth and into the time of eternity, love is the only legacy that matters.